in place, and then came reports of an active shooter, and definitely they had to respond to that. Have you seen any other kind of movement other than that one police cruiser that you saw earlier? Came reports of an active shooter.
From our Washington, D.C. affiliate, WUSA, of an unfolding situation. Those are the words, the description of Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson with regard to reports of an active shooter who has barricaded themselves in a third-floor medical facility room. The medical facility is the Malcolm Grow Medical Facility, again, on Joint Base Andrews. First responders are on the scene, and there's a lot to parse here. To do that, we welcome now Ron Hosko. He's a former FBI Assistant Director, joins us by phone. And Ron, we are hearing reports not just of an active shooter now at Joint Base Andrews, that perhaps this also came as a scheduled training exercise with regard to an active shooter situation was set to occur on the base. So what would that exercise have entailed?
Well, you know, this is the sort of exercise that's going around the country in schools and in government facilities, and that would ideally involve the notification of anybody who might misconstrue an exercise with something real world. Usually in the communications plan of an exercise like that, there is a part of a communications plan that says, hey, if we do have a real-world emergency, that here's how you would communicate that. So there is no confusion. Everybody's read in on the fact that there's an exercise going on, and if something real then breaks out, then immediate action can be taken, and the practice, the drill, can be suspended. So this could well be that kind of early fog of any report of an active shooter, trying to sort out what's real and what's make-believe.
What would be the initial response, aside from personnel being asked to shelter in place?
Well, obviously, internal base security. Andrews does have a fair amount of perimeter security checkpoints coming into and out of. And quite clearly, you know, the early part of an active shooter event is closing in on the location where the threat is emanating from, and that would the first responders would obviously be base security, the military police force at Andrews, supplemented very quickly by Prince George's County. That is the Maryland county that Andrews sits in the middle of. And as soon as they get notice of it, the FBI, Washington field office, the Baltimore field office, because of their proximity, would be mounting up their own resources and conducting liaison with the base to find out, what do you need from us?
Now, this is not just a very active base. It is also the transit point for the president. In fact, President Obama returned to Joint Base Andrews just last night, returning from a summit in Ottawa. In terms of security, is this essentially as secure a facility as exists in the United States?
I think so. You know, you do have that element that involves the not only the Air Force One, but the other support aircraft that support presidential travel. I saw a C-17 coming out of Andrews on my way into work this morning. It's a busy base, and so you're going to have enhanced security around that which is related to the president and the vice president, and then you have the typical base security that involve aircraft, the U.S. government aircraft. It's a big base, so you're going to have a perimeter. All these bases have some sort of perimeter, and then you're going to have checkpoints going into and out of. Now, those checkpoints, depending on the threat condition as perceived by the military or Homeland Security, they will ramp that up and tighten it so that they are actually scrutinizing your identification coming in, asking for your purpose. But sometimes it is far more relaxed than that, where you flash a driver's license, and in some of these locations, you know, you're on the base.
Ron, I want to ask you just to hang on one moment as we bring in our Jeff Pegues, who has been working this story there in Washington as well. Jeff Pegues, what can you tell us with regard to the situation at Joint Base Andrews at current?
Well, according to the law enforcement sources that I've spoken with, and I've talked to people in different agencies, and there's a lot of confusion right now in terms of what's actually going on this base. There are law enforcement sources that we've consulted that are being told that this is some sort of training exercise, and so that's what's sort of feeding this narrative here of confusion. Sure, any active shooter like situation or reported active shooter like situation, there's going to be some initial confusion as law enforcement responds to the scene, and I think that's what we have here. But what we're being told is that there was some exercise planned, but has there been some sort of development that has turned this into the real thing? And so that's what the people that we're talking to are trying to focus in on right now, exactly what is happening on this base. Josh?
It is an unfolding situation. That's the description of the Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson. Interesting, though, Jeff, we are also seeing the impact of the social media communication by the official account for Joint Base Andrews. It would suggest, even if this was some sort of training exercise, it might not have entailed a tweet to be sent, which of course has put so much of the response in motion.
Well, you're right. I mean, I think early on, the information that we're getting via social media is perhaps contributing to some of the confusion here. And that's not to say this may not be real, but what we're finding is that there's a lot of confusion about whether it is or not. You have different agencies responding. You have the ATF from Baltimore. They are involved in this, and they are heading to the scene. You have, of course, the FBI that would be involved in something like this, and so they're all trying to get as much information as possible to respond appropriately to this incident and to separate fact from fiction, if you will. They don't want people panicking unnecessarily. But, this is just one of those situations where early on, what we're seeing, the details are evolving as law enforcement tries to get a handle on what exactly is going on.
All right, Jeff Pegues, I know you'll be working your sources for us there in Washington and be with us throughout the morning. Ron Hosko remains with us, a former FBI assistant director, also a CBS News security consultant. And Ron, with regard then, you used the term, the fog of war, perhaps, this state of confusion that Jeff is describing. As we see multiple agencies also respond, the ATF in Baltimore, as Jeff mentioned, the FBI, local law enforcement, even Homeland Security being involved as well, how might that contribute, in fact, to the confusion that does seem, if nothing else, to be present here?
Yeah, initially, it can contribute a great deal to the confusion because by and large, these agencies are working on their own discrete radio channels that do not communicate with each other for the most part. And so they, in a perfect world, are converging on a common command post, a joint operations center, where clear and validated information is flowing in, where the deployment of personnel to respond to the incident, to a particular building, to a particular floor, to a particular room, is being coordinated. But that coordination is not set up instantaneously. And it often depends on those radio communications. And we have seen time and again where there are miscommunications, where bad information is put out. I'll go back to the Navy Yard, the Washington Navy Yard, where, and this happens commonly, it happened in Orlando, where there are almost always reports of multiple shooters. And in a case where you have a training exercise, potentially where what's known as simunitions are involved, simulated real handguns that deploy a simulated ammunition round. It makes a bang, it might shoot a little soap pellet. If those reports are being heard, and one person who didn't know about the exercise is then on Twitter or is making calls, you can have a lot of confusion and a big response to nothing at all.
We are seeing, with regard to Twitter and social media, and perhaps the impact that, too, is having on the state of confusion there at Joint Base Andrews. As I look at the official Twitter feed of the base in question, 5 minutes ago, saying the last tweet was sent some 5 minutes ago, saying more information will be released as it becomes available, although the Twitter feed does seem to be speaking to the serious nature of this report. If nothing else, are we also seeing, is this the danger of too much information being immediately accessible with regard to how these first reports on social media may have contributed to the response?
Yeah, there is a risk there, and we saw this at UCLA too, where this call goes out, and law enforcement in the region, certainly in the immediate area, are going to take it as very serious. You're going to see this kind of muscled up, very rapid response that could appear excessive. I go back to UCLA, where it was in effect a murder-suicide. Was there a risk that it could have been much worse than it was? Yes. But until you know what's real, you have to treat it as real. And the response reflects a very serious situation until you say it's not. And that response can look like overkill with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. But this is, with partial information, with mistaken information, with Twitter and all the other social media that law enforcement is going to have to, get access to as well. There's a great opportunity for confusion, for an overreaction, and for other mistakes to happen.
And this is also, of course, happening in the global context. In just days following the terror attacks in Istanbul, the CIA director's John Brennan statement that a similar attack in the U.S. homeland is something of a fait accompli. You also mentioned, Ron Hosko, the changes made in the aftermath of the Navy Yard shooting. What were they?
I'm sorry, in which shooting?
The Navy Yard.
Oh, well, always law enforcement is going to convene an after-action report. And almost always you are going to see and read about criticisms of communications. There has to be ideally a seamless approach, an integrated approach to people entering these buildings. And too often you have responders who are very well intended coming from all the different agencies flowing kind of uncontrolled into a building. And now you have a lot of guns in there, different communications channels. The challenge of communication, like in the Navy Yard, where you had a fire alarm going off, you had dead and dying victims. So the shock of that as they were being encountered, gunshots going off. It is a very, very dynamic situation, and sometimes not made easier by the fact that law enforcement has a sense of urgency.
Unavailable.
They have to get in there and stop what's going on. And their communications with each other are not always seamless. The notion that we can put everybody on a single radio channel and everybody can understand clearly the communications of everybody that's important is a faulty notion. Because I may have something that's absolutely critical to say, and 2 floors away somebody else has something critical to say, and we both key our mics at the same time, and nobody can hear any of it because we've what they call stepped on each other's communications. And so what you hear is a squelch noise. You may hear a word or two, but there's a risk of putting on everybody on the same radio frequency at the same time. So these are challenges that law enforcement will always have to overcome.
Ron, I'm sorry, we are watching now images of what appear to be personnel leaving the facility in question in groups. Some did have their hands up as if to show that they were not holding anything. Again, groups of anywhere between 8 and 12 people. So with regard then to what's happening right now, first of all, who's in charge right now of what appears to be an evacuation and much further extensive search of the facility in question?
Yeah, to me that would be the military police because they're on scene. They own this base. It is their jurisdiction. And then, kind of a joint command will start to form up where Prince George's County will be in there, leadership, and then you'll see some federal elements come in. And once again, the idea is to get the the leadership together, to get the tactical experts together, the tactical team leaders, and have the communication start to flow in a way that is joint, that everybody knows the best available information, and you're trying to exclude what's proven false, what's proven erroneous, so that the tactical responders know what they're getting into.
And as we see this response again unfolding and perhaps some sort of evacuation and further search of the facility underway, we are talking about a military base, Ron. And how does that impact then the investigation and really search for an active shooter when, in fact, so many on this base are, in fact, armed?
Yeah, that's always a concern, and frankly, as I mentioned earlier, this is a concern when law enforcement from different agencies converge on a location. What you don't want to have is what's known as a blue-on-blue incident, where good guys are shooting at good guys because I happen to see a gun come up and I didn't have communication with that person. So it makes it more challenging when you have an environment as here where there's a number of guns already on the base. There's military police on the base. What happens if it wasn't a real active shooter and the active shooter happened to be in uniform? That's one of those challenges law enforcement faces. It makes these situations, quite precarious.
Ron Hoskell, please do stay with us. I want to bring in quickly Steve Dorsey with CBS Radio News. He is on the phone and is, in fact, en route to the scene. Steve, what update, if any, can you tell us?
Well, Josh, I'm just a couple miles from the base, from the Maryland side of the base, and we know that this morning at about 9 a.m., there were reports of this active shooter at the Malcolm Grow Medical Facility, and everyone on base has been directed to shelter in place. But there was also scheduled to be an active shooter drill, an exercise this morning. However, there are what the base is calling real-world active shooter reports right now at that Malcolm Grow Medical Facility. And we are seeing first responders en route to this scene right now. We just saw a police car with lights and sirens heading in that direction. And, of course, the base is on a heightened state of concern, at least, following what happened in Istanbul, following news of increased security across the country during the beginning of this holiday weekend.
Again, Steve Dorsey with CBS Radio News en route to the scene. Thank you, Steve. And, of course, we'll be back with you as more news becomes available. I want to bring back Jeff Pegues now. Jeff, working your sources there in Washington. What more can you tell us?
Well, we've reached out to someone else here. One of our producers here at CBS News has reached out to someone with public affairs at Joint Base Andrews, and we're getting another view, if you will, about what is happening there. And it trends with what we've been reporting here, is that there was an active shooter exercise that was planned. And at some point during that exercise, the situation sort of evolved for some reason into something that appears to be a real active shooter situation. However, that has not been confirmed, that there is actually an active shooter situation underway. Does that make sense? And I say that because this is sort of adding to the confusion here. There is this uncertainty about what's going on. But when you have a situation like this, you're not going to take any chances if you're law enforcement and put your defenses down, assuming that the situation is all clear. You have to confirm that it is all clear before you can stand down. And I think that's what's going on here now. Again, we were told that there was some sort of active shooter situation planned. At some point, this evolved into a situation that may be real. And so now they're trying to confirm whether it is real. I know it sounds confusing, but that's what's going on here. And we've talked to multiple sources now from several different agencies, and this is the story that we are getting right now, which suggests that they are sort of leaning toward this having evolved into something that perhaps wasn't anticipated. But that there is no threat. At least that's where this appears to be going right now. Josh?
We can also tell you now that our Washington, D.C. affiliate WUSA is reporting that law enforcement officials with Prince George's County have told them that this is, in fact, the result of an active shooter drill and not, in fact, the real thing or an unfolding situation, as Jay Johnson, the Homeland Security Secretary, did call this just moments ago. It also begs the question, though, Jeff Pegues, if this was just a drill, how is it possible that the person or people in charge of the base's official Twitter account did not get that message?
You know what? That's a good question. And I think Mr. Hosko pointed this out, that there will be an after-action report, if you will, to get to the bottom of what went right and what potentially went wrong in this situation. You know, we have not heard conclusively yet that that there has been some sort of misinformation here, but the potential is there. And in a situation like this, they, as I said, they have to be 100% certain that this is not a real active shooter situation. But, you know, the reality is when you have a base as large as Joint Base Andrews, there may be people on that base who are not informed about an active shooter drill. And so they may not have known. The word may not have gotten out. So we'll just have to see how this unfolds.
Jeff Pegues in Washington again, working his sources. And Jeff, I know you'll be with us throughout this developing story. Thank you for that. I want to bring back Ron Hosko, again, a former FBI assistant director. And Ron, as we see more images then of what looks to be some sort of evacuation currently underway from the medical facility. We see one gentleman in medical scrubs, it appears. They are making their way all empty-handed, but rather leisurely, if you will, away from the facility. What would be happening right now as they go about confirming whether or not there is, in fact, an active shooter in that facility?
Well, first, they want to track back to the original source of the original reporting that there was an active shooter. They want to get back to that source, whether that was a 911 call, if there is, you know, a 911 system in place that you can see who called, or they took a name of the caller, a phone number of the caller, to get back to that person and say, tell us what you saw, where you saw it. But it is, I think, telling that you're seeing this more relaxed mode where you're seeing fewer people flowing in with adrenaline flowing, and we are not hearing reports of additional shooting. There's no suggestion of that. So this could have been that very discreet, small incident where somebody who wasn't in the loop on an active shooter drill saw a weapon, saw somebody acting furtively, and they were part of the theater of a drill and made that report in good faith because they didn't know, and you see the result then. So I'm encouraged by the fact that we haven't heard reports of additional shots being fired, or actually if any shots being fired. And now they're going to be tracking back to where were the original reports out of? Can we find that person? We talk to that person, find out what they saw, and we start to put this back in the box.
We're also joined by former ATF agent Matt Horace by phone, also a CBS News security consultant. And Matt, as we work to confirm the nature of this situation, whether or not it is in fact a drill, take us inside that facility right now as they move room by room, ensuring the safety therein. Certainly something that we heard to very devastating impact in the UCLA shooting of recent. What is it to be inside that facility right now as they are sweeping it?
Caution until they verify that this actually is just a drill and not a drill and an act of violence. And that's going to take some time depending on the size of the facility. They're going to go very methodically, room by room, floor by floor, until that building is entirely cleared. But I can tell you, having managed and worked on these operations on dozens of times throughout my career, that somewhere along the way we got to go back and determine where the communication mishap was, because as Ron said earlier, we practice these drills time and time again, and this is no ordinary base. This is the base where the President of the United States flies in and out of, and I think we're ill afford to be able to have these sort of lapses. So there's a lot of work that has to be done once we've nailed down exactly what happened here this morning.
And Matt, it was something that Ron and I were also discussing, but certainly an added element of the search is the fact that it is occurring on a military base where it would not be out of the ordinary to see many of the personnel on the base armed.
100%. And, we have 100% ID checks at certain points. Certain points you don't have it. But right now, the idea is to go with the intelligence we had. What information do we have to verify or didn't verify it and move forward and get these people back to safety and get that base back to operations? I'm still going to be interested to find out where the communication lapse was, why weren't people in the loop to the extent that they should have been, and how we can avoid having this happen in the future.
There certainly is a question, again, as the official Twitter account of Joint Base Andrews first alerted most here to the fact that there was an active shooter situation, an unfolding situation, as Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson would later call it. And it is also on Twitter where we can tell you that our D.C. affiliate WUSA is now reporting that Prince George's County Police and fire spokespersons have both confirmed that, in fact, this is a drill at Joint Base Andrews, although we here at CBS News are working to confirm that as well. So, Ron, in this period then of relative calm, we have mentioned the multiple agencies who would have responded as there was some sinking of the multiple agencies in play here. As this news now begins to trickle out that perhaps this was a confirmed drill, how would communication then go about interagencies within the agencies involved to make sure that everybody is now on the same page?
Yeah, certainly by now you're going to have some leadership elements of all the affected agencies, ideally in the same room, getting the same information that this was in fact a drill, having a conversation about, okay, let's look at our responses, what went well here. This in some ways is still good practice for the agencies, even though unintended practice and not planned practice. But it is valuable practice because then they can start to look at how were our communications? Did we come to the right location? Are we linked up with the right people? Did our tactical people go into the right places in a controlled manner, or was this kind of chaotic on the law enforcement side? What can we do better the next time? There are always lessons learned in these events. There are always, introspective conversations internal to each team, and then as a group. I want to know if I'm still in the FBI, did my folks get there in the right manner? Did they talk to the right people? How were our radio communications? How were our interpersonal meetings and discussions? How can we do this better the next time in the event that it's real?
Ron Hosko, again, FBI, former FBI Assistant Director, joining us here. Do stay with us, Ron, and you too as well, former ATF agent Matt Horace. We are going to stop down, take a quick break, take a look at our reporting, also consult with our Jeff McKays in Washington, working his sources as well. We'll reset things on the other side of the break, but stay with us. You're watching CBSN. You are looking at a picture of Joint Base Andrews in Maryland, still on lockdown after reports filtered out just after 9 a.m. Eastern that there was an active shooter in a medical facility there, barricaded into the third floor. First responders were quickly on scene, and all personnel on Joint Base Andrews were asked to shelter in place. There has been confusion as to the exact nature of this incident, and we do now have some more news there. We want to bring back our Jeff Begays in Washington. Jeff, what can you tell us?
Law enforcement sources, Josh, are confirming that the situation there is now all clear. And so what that suggests to us is that this is what we thought it was initially, which was a planned drill. But somewhere along the way, there was misinformation, and this turned into something that some people on the base and elsewhere thought was a real active shooter situation, but that is not the case. What I am hearing now from law enforcement sources who have confirmed this, the situation there is all clear. We should get the official word. There is a press conference that is setting up nearby that we suspect will confirm what we are now reporting, that this situation is all clear. The question is, what was it that led to that confusion? And hopefully we'll get more details about that as well.
Again, Jeff Begays in Washington. We do appreciate your reporting and remaining with us throughout the morning here. I want to bring back Ron Hosko, former FBI Assistant Director. Ron, with this news now that things are all clear, that perhaps there was no active shooter situation after all, it seems an almost surreal question to ask. But is it possible that even the response on social media and certainly the tweets sent by the official account of Joint Base Andrews could have been a part of this all?
Sure. Josh, in simple terms, something failed here. Something failed in a significant way. And the people who were involved in the exercise, in planning the exercise, in executing it, are going to have to take a hard look at themselves and say, okay, who did we fail to communicate with effectively that should have known that there was an exercise going on in a certain part of the base and didn't? How about internal communications, our base Twitter account, other social media? How could this thing spin so far out of control based on, the mistaken belief, presumably by somebody who was not in the loop, that there was an active shooter drill that goes viral and draws this sort of response? So they're going to have to take a hard look at themselves, because at the end of the day, even though there's some valuable takeaways from this, this involved a significant waste of time by a lot of people.
And we do have former ATF agent Matt Horace as well. And Matt, in the communication then, that this is that there isn't all clear, but as that would be communicated to those on the scene, and certainly those perhaps in that medical facility, searching, sweeping, going room by room, how would that have been communicated to those on the front line of this?
Well, once they got the building clear, they were going to communicate that to tactical commanders and on-scene commanders, and we don't know who that is. Presumably it's the military at this point. Once that is clear, it's going to be communicated to communications people that are going to coordinate the press conference, and that's usually the flow of information.
All right, Matt Horace, we thank you for your time. Ron Hosko as well for yours. Jeff Begays, of course, reporting for us from Washington throughout the morning. We will have him as well. And our Chris Van Cleve, we can tell you, is making his way to Joint Base Andrews, where they are, in fact, now setting up a press conference. There will be a briefing of a sort, and when that begins, we will have those comments for you live. Again, to recap then, reports just after 9 a.m. of an active shooter on Joint Base Andrews, barricaded in a medical facility there. It was then confirmed just a few moments ago that, in fact, part of a scheduled active shooter drill perhaps had been mistaken by someone or ones on the base. It may have contributed to the initial response by the official Twitter account of Joint Base Andrews, speaking to an active shooter situation. But again, we can tell you that the scene has been given the all clear, and there is no active shooter in place. Personnel were asked to shelter in place, and again, the nature of the personnel still on the base unknown at this time, but there is going to be a briefing happening in just a few moments, and when it begins, we'll have it for you here. Lots to get to, and stay with. Please do it with us. You're watching CBSN.